Even at one point, he's just making fun of this little girl that he'll eventually hang and watch her die as he masturbates. It's a hard evil to wrap your head around.
Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer, murdered at least 10 people in Wichita, Kansas, between 1974 and 1991.
What he made clear to us is that his only regret was he hadn't killed more people than the 10 that he had.
Hi, I'm Matilda from True Crime Uncut, and welcome to Closer to the Case. This week we're speaking with Kansas Deputy District Attorney Kevin O'Connor, who played an instrumental role in bringing BTK to justice. How did you first come across this case?
Well, since the time I started in the district attorney's office, which would have been late 1992, Kenny Landwehr, who was Lieutenant Landwehr, was always talking about the BT case. It was always something that he would remind us about, that it was still out there. And that was my first association with the case. And then I got involved more in the case when about a year or so before the letters started coming from Dennis Rader, when there was a search warrant that was requested for Mr. Wegerle's DNA. And it was the police were going through the case and looking at information and evidence based upon evidence being DNA evidence being more useful and having the ability to replicate it. Vicki Wegerle put up a great fight with Dennis Rader, and DNA was recovered from under her fingernails. The problem is that at the time, DNA couldn't be replicated like it could be now. Mr. Wegerle, her husband, was always considered to be a suspect. So at the time I became involved was when the DNA could be replicated, and so they had the ability to replicate the DNA so you would have enough to be able to test it without using up your full sample. And so these detectives at the time, what they were doing was working to clear Mr. Wegerle, to show once and for all that he did not kill his wife. And so that was my first association with it, is using the evidence from the case and the science of DNA to try to finally, once and for all, clear Mr. Wegerle.
What was the reaction to BTK re-emerging?
Well, what happened was he sent a letter. It went to the Wichita Eagle, the newspaper, and then the newspaper turned it over to Wichita police, and they didn't hear back for a while, so they followed up on it. And this letter was then eventually provided to Lieutenant Landwehr. And I believe, as I understand, Lieutenant Landwehr knew right away that this was either a BTK or if it was somebody that had found his evidence, his stash. And so once that happened, once that reemergence, or when he recontacted, I was assigned by the district attorney to be a liaison with law enforcement, meaning that if they needed anything of a legal basis, they would contact me. I would be their contact person. And then I would, of course, report back to the district attorney, letting her know the status and the progress of the investigation.
How did the community react?
I think there was a lot of people in the community that were shocked because I think there was a belief that he had either died or gone to prison. That's why they hadn't heard from him in such a long time. So I think there was an initial shock, but there was an attempt right away to notify the community, and there was an awful lot of responses to a request for information that went out. So it was a very hectic and trying time. You had a lot of responses, and like what you referred to is that anybody that you were angry with, you would report them as BTK. The problem with that is that every lead needs to be investigated. And one of the ways we went about is requesting DNA, because DNA was the most time-efficient manner in which to eliminate somebody as a suspect. Trying to go back and say, where were you 30 years ago at the time the Oteros were murdered? That's more difficult to investigate rather than getting your DNA and comparing it to the DNA we had from the crime scenes, which would eliminate you. That's the most efficient way. That created somewhat of a stir in the community about collecting DNA and the privacy issues involved in that. But most people were cooperative in that effort.
How did Rader's communication with police lead to his downfall?
He wanted the attention, he craved the attention, and this craving for attention was ultimately his undoing. He had asked if he could send in a disc that couldn't be traced, and he asked the police to put an ad in the paper saying, it's okay. And so the police lied to Dennis Rader, and he sent the disc that eventually led to his capture. And I remember, and will never forget, being present when the disc was put into the computer, and Randy Stone, the computer expert, went through the language on the disc, which is beyond me. I mean, I was present there, and as he scrolled through it, there's a lot of gibberish, is I guess the best word for it. And then you see Dennis, and then more gibberish, and you see Christ Lutheran Church. And then when you saw that, there was another detective sitting next to Randy, who then Googled the Christ Lutheran Church, and there up in the corner of their website was the picture of the president of the church, Dennis. And it's at a time where I still get goosebumps remembering that, because you're looking at that and going, that's him. And from then on, it was a process of us hunting him rather than the other way around.
What were the next steps after realizing the killer was Dennis Rader?
After the disc and after finding the Christ Lutheran Church, then what law enforcement did is they went about in stalking him, finding out about him. And there was a lot of discussion about, can we get DNA from him, and how would we go about getting DNA from him? And, you know, it's not TV where you get a coffee cup that he's using. That may work, and more likely that it wouldn't. So we went about really investigating him, and it turned out that he had a daughter that would have gone to a university, and there was the known fact that she would have had a pap smear. And so we went about legally, we went about trying to get access to that evidence, because we could do reverse DNA, and that would be able to tell us whether her father was the person that left DNA at 3 of the crime scenes. And so we went about seeking that evidence unbeknownst to her, and so we got access to that evidence, and then compared the DNA from that evidence to the crime scenes. And what that would be able to tell us was that her father was BTK, or was the person who left the DNA at the 3 crime scenes. Lieutenant Landwehr sent a couple detectives out to his residence, Rader's residence in Park City, which is a suburb just north of Wichita. And the officers pulled up, and they noticed a car in the driveway that was part of the investigation. And so they wanted to make an arrest. And I'll never forget Kenny Landwehr calling them back in and saying, we're going to do this right. And we're going to lock it down so no mistakes are going to be made. And how Kenny Landwehr, after all of this time, how much he would have wanted to make that arrest right away. He did the right thing, stepped back, and we went about researching and investigating Dennis Rader. So for about a week, we knew who he was. He, of course, didn't know that we knew who he was. And then on the night when they put the plans in place to make an arrest the next day, it was a truly fascinating event to be a part of, much like a military strike in certain ways. The plan was to control certain sites all at once, so you wouldn't have anybody aware that something is happening in one place that might tip somebody off. And it was really brilliant and great work. If you go back and look, you'll notice that there was never, Lieutenant Landwehr never ran Dennis Rader down, never called him a coward or anything of that nature, was always saying, I would like to speak with this person, and playing to Dennis Rader's ego. And it worked out brilliantly. It worked. And it eventually led to his capture, because I think Dennis Rader got comfortable with that and made a bad mistake.
What was the interview with Rader like?
When they get him into the interview room, it takes about a couple hours before he eventually says that he is BTK. I was in another room watching it just to make sure that there were no issues, legal issues about the statement. And so you see the back and forth, the cat and mouse between Lieutenant Landwehr and the individuals from the FBI and Dennis Rader, and how they go back and forth. And even during that process, right before he says he's BTK, he turns to Lieutenant Landwehr and says, "Why did you lie to me?" And I'll never forget Lieutenant Landwehr saying straight to him, "Because I was trying to catch you." And it's really a fascinating part of that statement. But what you did learn from him is that there was some initial discussion about what would happen to his family and concern for his family. But as soon as he told us that he was BTK, he never mentioned his family again. And he made it very clear, even in statements that he made, that this is who he truly was. This murderer, a very evil person, is what you discover from listening to him describe his murders. And even at one point, he stands up and mimics the little Otero girl, and when she's crying out, and it's something that it's hard to sit there and listen to, because he's just making fun of this little girl that he'll eventually hang and watch her die as he masturbates. And so it's a hard evil to wrap your head around. It's just awful. He was very proud of his murders, and there was absolutely no remorse ever from Dennis Rader. There is somewhat of a disappointment in how intellectually inferior he is. He's no mastermind. He just had the ability not to tell people what he was doing, not a soul. And he had that ability, but he was not a very smart person. And his intellect, or lack thereof, is striking, really. He was a killer, and he was able to react to the situation that he was in, and maybe had enough sense not to act as he got older.
Was it clear Rader was a disturbed individual?
There really wasn't any indication, and he wanted to make it clear, and did throughout the interview at various times, saying, "I was not abused. I was not sexually or physically abused. I did what I did because I liked doing what I did." And he wanted to make that very clear. He didn't want this to be blamed on an abusive father, or something that had happened in his family, or some sexual abuse or anything else. He made it very clear that he did what he did because he enjoyed doing what he did. And if he had more time and didn't have a family, there would have been more victims. What he made clear to us is that his only regret was he hadn't killed more people than the 10 that he had.
Did Rader have a motive?
You really do think about that. What motivated him? Why? I think that's a question that everybody asks. And I have come to believe that there's just evil in the world. And he personified it. It's hard to explain. And I've spoken to a lot of people about this case, and I've even thought about it a lot myself. And the only conclusion I can come to is that he's just evil. He truly enjoyed the suffering of others. And his method of murder was hard to grasp and understand. And maybe it's a good thing that it's hard to understand, because maybe if we understood it, there may be something wrong with us. And there's just sometimes you have to accept that there's evil in the world, and we have to be thankful that there's good guys and good gals out there that are always battling that evil. And I think the law enforcement in this community is a perfect example of that.
Was there a reason for the public sentencing?
Dennis Rader did not want to have a public hearing that aired all of his issues, because what he was exposed at was he was exposed as a sexual deviant and stuff that was embarrassing. So he did not necessarily want to have a hearing. He pled guilty to the murders, and he tried to avoid any type of hearing whatsoever. The district attorney thought that it was very important that the community knows what happened. And the best way to do that is to have a public hearing. Because once it's a public hearing, then it's open. It's out there, and people can have access to that information, and it wouldn't be buried and kept secret under investigatory files. So it was important to this community to have this airing out. The community and the world deserve to know what happened in this case. So that was the main reason for having that. Legally, there was one of his murders occurred. We didn't have a death penalty in Kansas. So to make that clear, we could not seek to have Dennis Rader put to death because we didn't have a death penalty in Kansas at the time. We did have what was called a hard 40 sentence, where a person was sentenced to life and wouldn't be eligible for parole until they served 40 years. In order to obtain a hard 40 sentence, there is a process for that, a legal process, which requires a hearing and evidence being presented to show aggravating factors as to why Dennis Rader should receive a hard 40 sentence. Because under the law at the time, a life sentence actually meant 15 years. So you could stack those life sentences, but it was important to us as prosecutors and important to the district attorney to make sure that Dennis Rader received the absolute maximum sentence that he could receive.
What happened at the hearing?
I can't begin to tell you the hours that went in preparation. Before the capture or the arrest of Dennis Rader, I read all the police reports, and there were literally thousands of reports to read in preparing for his ultimate arrest, because Kenny Landwehr was confident at some point he would be arrested. So we were preparing for the trial long before he was ever arrested. And once he was arrested and we knew that he was going to enter a plea and we knew we were going to have a sentencing hearing, we went about dividing the case up so it could be broken down. And Mrs. Folston took some of the cases and prepared those. I took some of the cases, and then Kim Parker took some of those, and we divided them out and presented. For example, I presented evidence at the sentencing hearing on the Oteros and Catherine Bright. And then the other homicides were divided up between Mrs. Folston and Kim Parker. Dennis Rader kept everything that he had sent to law enforcement. He had notebooks with all of the information, news reports about the murders that he had kept all those years. And of course, then you also had the DNA evidence that linked him to 3 of the homicides, and the Oteros, Nancy Fox, and Vicki Wegerle. Dennis Rader entered a plea in front of Judge Waller at the time, and Judge Waller had him describe in detail what he had done, which is somewhat unusual because you can do a plea and simply recite the elements of the offense and just say, yes, I did that. And in this particular case, Judge Waller required him to give a detailed explanation of why he thought he was guilty. So that was one hearing. And he went about describing in detail what he had done, and it was quite shocking to individuals. And of course, it was covered by the media. And then at the sentencing hearing, he is allowed to make a statement, and he did. And his statement again showed his arrogance and his lack of remorse. And then you had an opportunity for the victims and their families to make a statement, and it was just truly heartbreaking and painful. But hopefully it helped them that finally, after all these years, the person that had murdered their loved one was done, was going to prison. Well, he was sentenced to 10 life sentences, and of course, it's a death sentence to him because of his age. He would never get out of prison again.
How did the victims' families react?
I think it must have been very, very hard for them. We spent an awful lot of the time with those families, and they're always in my thoughts because of how painful it must have been, how hard it was for them. But they were very brave, and they made statements and described the impact that this had. And it didn't matter if it was 30 years ago; you could still feel that pain. So it was a very difficult hearing, but very brave individuals that had waited a long time for justice. And hopefully, I hope that they receive justice.
Did Rader get what he deserved?
Well, I know that there was some commentary about what difference does it make whether he pled to 10 murders or 2 murders. Well, it makes a difference to that particular victim's family. And so when there was a request to let him plead to some and dismiss others, the district attorney, Mrs. Folston, rejected that out of hand, that there were 10 homicides and 10 homicides were going to be accounted for. So whether he got what he deserved, I don't know. He got the maximum sentence that the law would allow at the time. He wanted the attention, he craved the attention, and this craving for attention was ultimately his undoing. And I think he thought that he was too smart to get caught, but he made a fatal mistake. And I think, again, it goes to the credit of law enforcement and the behavior and analysts at the FBI that provided support and information and a strategy on how to continue to talk to Dennis Rader through the media.
Dennis Rader pled guilty to his crimes after being arrested in February 2005. He was given 10 consecutive life sentences. He is currently incarcerated at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. For more content like this, please remember to like, subscribe, and hit that hype button. Remember to also click the link in the description to join our free Patreon and Discord servers. I'm Matilda from True Crime Uncut. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.